Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism with fellow editors and fellow Marks, Mark Leibecke and Mark Melton, covering three issues from this week. Two articles from Providence, one on the legacy and lessons for America of the Czechoslovak freedom leader Václav Havel, by a writer named Lubomir Martin Ondrasek, who I think studied with Mark Leibecke, who knows how to pronounce his name, but he can correct me. A piece by a regular contributor, Eric Patterson, on the moral and spiritual implications of the Olympics, Winter Olympics in China. And then finally, an article not from Providence, but to which we will be responding, which appeared in the New York Times by, I'll call them an integralist trio, Sohrab Ahmari, Gladden Papin, and Patrick Deneen, advocating a new foreign policy perspective over and against the previous conservative consensus, which they disdain as hawkish, wanting a more quote unquote restrained perspective that also calls for respecting China as a civilizational equal. Interesting. But first, Václav Havel. Mark Leibecke, you've lived in Eastern Europe. I believe you know the author. Your thoughts, what can Václav Havel teach us today? Of course, he was the first president of a post-Soviet bloc Czechoslovakia, man, I suppose, left of center, but obviously anti-communist, and the author says he very much would oppose the challenges to American democracy today, both from the right and the left. What say you?
Yeah, I think Lubo is absolutely correct. Václav Havel was almost certainly largely a man of the right, but with a lot of conservative sensibilities. I think that simply occurs to one naturally when they've had to endure the Soviet Union for as long as he had. What can he teach modern day America? He, as I don't know that he would self-proclaim as a Christian realist. I think he had religious tendencies. I think he was a Christian. I don't actually recall, and Lubo will kick me for this, whether or not he
was not officially religious.
What's that?
I think he was not officially religious.
I know that's certainly the popular take. You read some of his stuff, you listen to some of his speeches, it gets occluded. But regardless, he was certainly a man who believed in at least one of the dispositions of the Christian realist, which is to call things by their proper name. Soviet propaganda was all about subterfuge and letting names fall far away from the reality of the thing. And Havel believed to the core of his being that freedom begins with scrupulous honesty. And so I think that's one of the things that he would insist on, is that people continue to call things by what they really are. And so when you take that and you compare it to the woke agenda that Lubo is speaking about, there's an awful lot of things that Havel would have a problem with in today's sort of vapid, feckless, political correct society. He would insist that freedom begins with honesty. And we're not seeing a whole lot of that, certainly on the progressive left, on the campus culture. And I think those would be some of the things that Lubo will probably be drilling down on in future articles. And I think Havel would be essential in helping us work through. Politics of responsibility requires an accurate description of the things on the ground before you can do anything else.
Of course, Havel's addressed Congress in a joint session of Congress after he became president of Czechoslovakia, and he was seemingly a fan of the Declaration of Independence of the United States and a believer in the individual and the dignity of the individual, which certainly speaks to today's preoccupations with whether it's wokery on the left or tribalism on the right.
Correct, absolutely.
Mark Melton, Eric Patterson's piece on the Olympics, understandably and rightly expressing concerns about how China is exploiting its status as host of the Olympics, recalling how who exploited the 1936 Olympics, and of late or more recently, or a recall to some of us old enough, the the US-led boycott of the 1980 Olympics hosted by the Soviet Union. Eric Patterson, if I understand him correctly, does not think these Olympics should have been boycotted in hopes that Western athletes will strive to do well and to prevail and be a witness to Western values in so doing. But he also advocates a very wary view of how China is going to exploit the Olympics and advocates that we strive to avoid subsidizing or encouraging corporate sponsors who seem somehow to align with China's interests. He's a little bit ambivalent whether or not Americans should be watching the Olympics, but what are your thoughts, Mark Melton?
Right. So, I mean, basically, as you say and describe, he is saying, I mean, he's giving a good historical analysis of different types of boycotts that have been done in the Olympics, including against South Africa. I forget some of the other countries that or people boycotted because I think South Africa was participating, if I remember that bit correctly. But he gives basically different ways of how boycotts have occurred. Oh, and for clarification, when I meant South Africa, I meant apartheid South Africa. And but yeah, like you said, he kind of lands on this notion that the athletes should probably not boycott, that they should be an example, and that kind of like Jesse Owens in Nazi Germany when they hosted the Olympics, and so kind of to override kind of a narrative. And so I think some people disagree with that. I've seen on Facebook and Twitter, people commenting, not necessarily I think on this article, but some other content I've seen. But that's what I mean. Eric Patterson is responding to a lot of this anger about the US even participating in the Olympics. And I do wonder what would the effectiveness be of any boycott if that could possibly backfire on the US. So I think he makes a good point about, at least showing up. Like, we don't need to send our, official delegations over there. So I think he makes some good arguments on this. And it was something that I had heard about, but hadn't really thought through a whole lot. But yeah, like you said, he seems ambivalent about people watching. If I remember correctly, I think he basically says we should consider it. And he gives an example of it was another type of protest that someone was going to watch. Honestly, I haven't watched the Olympics much, but that's just because I haven't. I would rather, I'm getting ready for the Super Bowl. That's what I really care about. That's coming up. So.
Well, you certainly have your priorities, Mark Melton.
Yes.
Well, and then finally, this piece by the three integralist thinkers advocating a restrained U.S. foreign policy. I'm going to write a piece in response. Mark Levesque, maybe you are as well. Hopefully others will. It seems to be mostly an echo of conventional pseudo-paleo-conservative critique of American allegedly neoconservative foreign policy over the last 30 years. They want a sort of pullback from international commitments. They sort of fault the US and NATO for provoking Russian anxieties via NATO expansion. They, by implication, don't want a strong US stance with the Ukraine against Putin. And although they do sort of affirm standing against Chinese international expansionism, they also are wary of confrontation. They want collaboration with China and want America to respect China as a civilizational equal in their words, and instead for America to focus on domestic concerns and interest, rebuilding our industrial capacity and presumably working on the social concerns that are of special interest to integralists. So I found their proposals not new or creative or not especially very interesting, but their, as I perceive it, soft attitude towards China, I think, comes from their overall very negative attitude towards America, which they view as decadent. That's my thought. What say you, Mark Levesque?
Yeah, you would have to be pretty down on the United States to say that China currently is our civilizational equal. So, I mean, I knew they were thinking things were going badly here, and many of us do, but that takes us to all new, I was going to say levels, but more precisely depths. It's asinine to suggest, I think, that the United States presently is a civilizational equal with China. That's overstated and incredibly unfortunate. So that said, I largely agree with you. I think it was a full of rhetoric, but essentially calorie-free essay on kind of their ongoing complaint. It was pretty short on concrete proposals. Not exactly sure how we're supposed to retreat on China while continuing to pursue some of their aspirations. I think any sort of, or I guess I'm sorry, I've sort of went to the punchline. They didn't say retreat on China. They said restraint on China. But their prescription seems to be essentially retreat, because any other means of restraining China is going to be incredibly active. And in fact, you could take the Olympic piece by Patterson and couple it with this, that some of their proposals might have been some of Eric's proposals, which is, okay, we don't necessarily need to militarily confront China unnecessarily or provoke them unnecessarily, but there's a whole bevy of very savvy foreign policy things we can do short of war. Let's ostracize them to the degree that we're able. Let's, have the IOC get some grit and ban them from the Olympics until they stop some of their genocidal policies, etc. So there's all sorts of things one can do to avoid military confrontation to the best that we're able. But I don't think they would look quite like the way the authors would want them to look. Retreat or restraint can be a very active foreign policy. So not really sure what they're after. I think the situation is a little bit more complex than restraint, or what was they called us Crusader nation. I think there's an awful lot of space in between for a lot more intelligent foreign policy.
Do you think there are parallels between this perspective from the self-identified new right and the old left in terms of their attitude towards America and the world stage?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be, right. And it seems to be, certainly in the sense that America's imperialist ambitions, that we ought to be inwardly focused, not seeking, as they say, quoting Adams, monsters to fight, more of a retrentionist. So nothing new.
Mark Melton, any thoughts on this integralist manifesto for American foreign policy?
Yeah, I think your question or your comment about the old left, I think, is apt. When I read it, I thought about Henry Wallace's speech. Obviously, there are major differences there, but in 1946, Henry Wallace gave a speech that said the U.S. needed to stop this get tough on Russia. And basically, Henry Wallace was a former vice president under FDR, and then was replaced with Truman. And then he runs against Truman, I think in 48, and loses spectacularly. And Truman still becomes president or wins the election. So anyway, so I thought there were some kind of parallels there. It might be interesting to dive deeper into that, but I think kind of the root similarity, I think, between the two is that they're both aiming at domestic policies, where I think Henry Wallace wanted a left-wing socialist communist agenda for America, and the new right, different tact, but their foreign policy is being driven by what they want domestically. And I think the problem with that goal is that sometimes, in the case of Henry Wallace, it depended upon what Soviet Union was going to do, and after the Czechoslovak coup, that was not going to happen. And so eventually Henry Wallace came out and recanted, and actually became a Republican voter later on, which is interesting, and a agricultural capitalist, and probably had much more impact on the rest of society doing that than he ever did in politics. But with the new right, like Levecki was saying, there's a huge difference. They try to set up like this dichotomy of like, you're either a crusader, neocon, or you're restraint. And in the Dispatch, let me pull the guy up here. I think he had a really good, Klon Kitchen, if I'm saying his name right. He, I think, had a really good takedown and analysis of where this new right foreign policy agenda is trying to go and how it's already been kind of laid out. But there's a huge, there's a lot of variety in the foreign policy going on that they're ignoring. And basically, I think in the end of that article, he says if basically restraint is just Obama's pivot to Asia or a variation of that, then that's really not anything new or interesting. But if it's more than that, if it's pulling back much further than that, then there's going to be, I think, a lot of other problems if we completely retreat from the world.
Well, as I read this Integralist manifesto from Sohrab, et cetera, I was recalling George McGovern's theme of 1972 as he ran for president, "Come home, America." So this idea of retrenchment and withdrawing from international responsibilities is persistent in American history, as is the so-called crusader mentality of spreading the light and fruit of democracy around the world. So that tension inevitably will continue. Gentlemen and fellow editors and fellow Marks, thank you for this latest episode of Marksism. Until next week, bye-bye.